In the Montana Territory, during September the year 1883, from the mountain range the wind gusted, bitter, and carried a promise. That promise, anyone with knowledge of it could perceive in the chilly atmosphere that arrived earlier than normal for the season. Winter approached early that year. It would be brutal to anyone who lacked preparation to endure months of freezing temperatures that could slay livestock in the fields and people in their beds, if the log homes were not adequate to hold the heat that distinguished survival from death. Meanwhile, his neighbors hastened to erect log homes and gather provisions of firewood necessary to survive the approaching months. One man stayed aloof from the commotion, the frenzied atmosphere that marked the community throughout this period of crucial groundwork. Don Makecood, a stonemason hailing from the Scottish Highlands, who had come just 2 seasons earlier, carrying only his tools as a stonecutter and a head brimming with age-old expertise, was engaged in a task that made absolutely no sense to any observer of his labor. He was constructing a foundation of such immense size, so needlessly deep, in the opinion of everyone that the region's builders were aware regarding proper methods, that experienced workmen halted their own tasks merely to shake their heads in disbelief at the squandering of time and energy that they saw. "That Scottish fellow has gone crazy," they murmured to each other. They, with the assurance of those who understood that their correctness came from experience that had shown them the method of constructing the log houses on this ground. All that stone for what purpose? Nobody constructs such bases because nobody requires such foundations. Yet Duncan had witnessed something in his homeland that these pioneering constructors had overlooked or maybe never learned, since their customs originated from regions where cold seasons did not require the same degree of cleverness to endure. An element concerning warmth and rock and endurance that successive generations of Scottish Highland stoneworkers had perfected across hundreds of years of compelled testing by environments that destroyed those who failed to grasp the teachings that winter imparted without compassion. Duncan Makecood wasn't a person who talked a great deal, because words seldom convinced individuals who had already concluded they knew better. At the age of 42, he departed the island of Skye, with nothing besides the tools his father had bestowed upon him, and the understanding passed down through many generations of Highland builders, who had learned to survive winter seasons that could take a man's life while he slept, if his dwelling was not sufficient to preserve the warmth that life demanded. When he claimed his 160 acres along Lolo Creek, the new settlers' prudence that always accompanied the coming of the new neighbors was evident. An extra pair of hands was always valuable in a community where the plus employment was always plentiful. A different builder having experience was even more beneficial, since he could offer expertise along with physical work to endeavors that were advantageous for all. However, when Dunan initiated his cabin construction in the beginning of September, outlining a trench for the foundation that went down 1.2 meters in depth and stretched an extra 45 centimeters past where the walls would later be erected, the hopefulness changed to bewilderment that swiftly transformed into outright derision that the workers made no effort to conceal. "McLeod, that's double the depth you require for cabin footings," remarked William Hendricks, a builder who had constructed 11 log houses in the region and knew precisely how deep those foundations needed to be to ensure sufficient steadiness by avoiding unnecessary effort in pointless digging. "You're squandering many days of hard work digging all the way to the bedrock." No one does that because there's no need to. Dunan merely nodded to show he had heard the words without hinting that the words would alter what he was doing. He persisted in completing it with the resolve of a person who understood precisely why he was doing what he was doing, even if there existed no justification to explain it to men unwilling to listen to reasoning that contradicted their preconceived notions. Then arrived the stone. Cartload after cartload of sandstone and limestone hauled from a quarry 13 kilometers away. Trips that each took half a day, and Duncan was reborn over and over while his neighbors completed the walls and roofing, employing techniques that required only a small fraction of the time that the Scotsman spent investing in foundations that nobody understood. Each piece was categorized by him with the accuracy of a jeweler, inspecting gemstones, selecting based on density and thermal characteristics that the majority of people couldn't even identify, since they never had cause to learn that various stones acted differently when it came to heat absorption and release. "What in the name of God are you building?" asked Hendrik, watching as Dunn placed stones into a foundation wall that reached nearly 1 meter above the ground surface, 30 centimeters taller than any foundation of a cabin located in the valley, where nobody recognized any value in carrying it out. A fortress, or something similar, proposed another onlooker who was unable to envision any other justification for the extensive materials gathered, where typically there would be merely a basic foundation to hold up the timber walls that comprised the main structure. "A home," answered Duncan, merely employing the term that in English signified both hearth and dwelling, allowing his audience to interpret it however they desired. But it was not merely a dwelling in the way his neighbors comprehended the term. What Duncan was constructing was a heat-absorbing battery, an enormous collection of rock that would collect, retain, and gradually emit warmth throughout the harsh winter season in Montana. While others struggled, they would face difficulties sustaining livable temperatures by using firewood at rates that would deplete their stockpiles well before the arrival of spring. He had observed this principle working in the historic black houses of Scotland, where families managed to survive in dwellings that looked primitive to modern viewers. Yet they were in fact examples of brilliant thermal design, honed through centuries of trial and error. Their lives hinged on creating methods that succeeded when failure brought death. Just the foundations would hold more than 2,700 kilograms of stone. It was meticulously chosen based on qualities that optimized the ability to store thermal energy. The cavity of crawl space underneath the cabin's floor would not go to waste, as his neighbors thought when they saw the foundation's unusual height. It was going to be a thermal chamber intended to let the warm air from inside the house flow under the whole living area before ascending via vents positioned with careful strategy in the flooring. His neighbors perceived waste and excess. Duncan recognized survival, crafted based on rules that had been tested by generations in weather conditions as harsh as any that Montana could offer. "You are placing more rock into your base than most people put into their entire fireplace," noted Henry Volkov. He was a Russian newcomer who had constructed his own log home the previous year earlier. He had acquired techniques in his native land, where the winters were equally severe. Yet it seems they had not created similar methods to those of the Scottish Highlanders. That represents insanity for the home of a lone individual who has no need for a stronghold. Tun raised his gaze from his labor, perspiration blending with rock powder on his visage worn by years of outdoor labor in environments that would not tolerate frailty. "In the Scottish Highlands there existed a proverb my father imparted to me as a boy, mastering the craft by his side. The rock recalls the blaze. You'll grasp its significance come January when winter truly sets in." Yet, they wouldn't comprehend. Not at first. Initially, they would chuckle, since chuckling was simpler than acknowledging that maybe they weren't omniscient about all that. They believed they had expertise in building, heating, and staying alive in regions where winter claimed the lives of anyone who erred. By mid-October, the groundwork of Duncan had been finished, and the edifice that rose above them made the foundation of stone appear even more ridiculous because of the contrast between the immense size underneath and the smallness above. The cabin by itself was humble by all measures, a mere 6 by 7 meters of interior area, just one chamber, the construction typical log building employing lodgepole as others commonly used. Nothing remarkable, except for those foundations that appeared to be part of a structure entirely distinct. The wall of foundations reached nearly 1 meter above the ground surface, constructed with 2 circular rings of stone with a gap of 15 centimeters separating them. This gap was not left void, as it would typically be in standard building methods. Duncan packed that space with smaller stones and clay, forming a thermal insulating mass capable of absorbing heat from inside, while preventing the entry of cold from outside. The overall thickness of this base wall measured 55 centimeters, nearly twice the thickness that any builder local would have deemed more than adequate for any cabin a person might require. The foundation sat directly on bedrock at 1.2 meters below ground, where the temperature stayed steady at about 10 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of how frigid the air above ground became. This deep placement led to the foundations absorbing mild warmth from the earth itself, a geothermal concept that Duncan could not articulate using scientific terms, yet this principle he fully understood via empirical evidence passed on by generations of craftsmen who had observed that buildings with foundations deep stayed warmer than those lying near the surface. Inside, under the flooring of the cabin, rested the authentic ingenuity of design. It remained unseen from outside, and Duncan did not attempt to clarify it to individuals who had already determined that his project was sheer folly. A region of crawl space, 60 centimeters in height, with a floor of level stones, producing what present-day engineers would name a plenum, a thermal chamber designed to evenly distribute heated air beneath the entire occupied area. The primary hearth was placed precisely at the cabin's center, constructed directly on top of the bedrock that extended below it. The firebox was elevated 45 centimeters above the stone floor of the crawl space, featuring ducts that allowed warmth to circulate beneath the floor before rising through 3 vents positioned near the outer walls, where cold air tended to gather in conventional cabins. Underfloor heating, explained Duncan to Hendricks as the carpenter paused to observe the building work. He found it odd how he couldn't stop staring, although he still thought it was a waste of effort. This stone beneath absorbs the heat as the fire burns, holds it in its bulk, then releases it gradually throughout the night. As the flames die down, your floor stays warm, even though the fire is out, active. That is how most difficult it is to build a cabin I have ever seen in my life, said Hendrik, shaking his head, with the assurance of a person who had constructed enough buildings to know what functioned and what was unnecessary complexity. And I still maintain you are using thrice the stone needed for any practical purpose. You could have built that fireplace and chimney with half the material, and it would have worked just as well as all the hearths I have built. Duncan placed his palm against the stone of the base, senses the thickness of substance, its capacity to retain power that other craftsmen never thought about, since they had never known to regard rock in terms of thermal qualities. This rock will hold warmth for 8 hours after the flame is fully extinguished. Your traditionally constructed home will hold warmth for perhaps just 2 hours before the chill overwhelms the space. 8 hours of warmth with no flames. Hendrik chuckled with the skepticism of someone who heard an assertion he deemed impossible, considering all that his expertise had instructed him. Rock does not behave that manner, MacLeod. It warms up when there is fire close by. Naturally, anyone can notice that, but it loses heat equally as fast when the flame disappears. This is how heat functions. It spreads into the cooler air that is around it. But not this stone. No. Dunn pointed towards the foundation's mass that rose up around him like a tiny fortress. Sandstone 55 centimeters deep, heated to 60 degrees, emits that heat at roughly 3 degrees per hour because the mass opposes change. That's fundamental heat retention that any Highland stonemason learns before reaching 20. Hendrik had no response to that, because he had never heard anyone discuss stone in terms of temperature and time, as though they were quantifiable units that could be measured and computed. It seemed like mathematics applied to stonework, a combination that did not align with anything his experience as instructed by a carpenter regarding practical building techniques. However, the greatest debate was yet to arise when Duncan unveiled his blueprint for a hearth that deviated even further radically from conventional norms. He constructed his fireplace not on the gable's edge, as was typical in all valley cabins, but right at the middle of the building. It ascended from the fireplace, which already sat at the core of the main room. The chimney was enclosed within a stone column that ran from the base up to the roof. Over 1,900 kilograms of extra stone stood inside the living area, whereas any other builder would have left empty space that would let the motion and functional application of the binotop, the interior CTZit remarks. You are positioning a stone tower right at the center of your cabin, which will obstruct every movement you take within your own house, noted Samuel Priter, an experienced constructor from Pennsylvania who traveled to Montana seeking opportunities and had constructed 43 buildings during his career without ever requiring anything similar to what the Scotsman was building. That occupies precious floor space and serves no practical purpose that I can see. The heat ascends the chimney and goes out above. You are only creating extra work for no reason. Heat rises, concurred Duncan, without disputing the basic point of physics that everyone understood, yet the stone first intercepts it before it departs. This axis will disperse heat in every direction, akin to a secondary home positioned upright. Every surface of the visible stone will be a face that emits warmth into the living area, rather than allowing it to flee toward the sky, where it serves no one. Richard slowly shook his head in the manner one does when beholding utter madness that cannot be rationalized because it surpasses logic. MacLeod, I have erected 43 edifices in my career, operating in 3 distinct states prior to arriving here. None required a column of stone at the center, occupying space that could serve for living. Are you overcomplicating this? when simple answers suffice flawlessly? Come November, Doonan had closed the gaps between his logs and readied himself for the upcoming winter. The Valley's agreement was unanimous and unmistakable among individuals who seldom concurred on any point. The Scotsman had erected a testament to his own stubbornness, undeniably vast in size, but ultimately a squandering of labor and materials that would have been better utilized on proven techniques that succeeded. That cabin will be as cold as a tomb when the true winter arrives. Indeed, Hendricks remarked to his wife, with the confidence of someone who knew he was correct, all that rock will simply siphon heat from the air, since this is stone's nature. It absorbs warmth from the surroundings. That unlucky man will become frozen in his own stronghold, and then will discover if he still maintains that belief he possessed more insight than men who had built in this place for many years. Duncan overheard the remarks that reached his hearing, for nothing stayed confidential in a close-knit community where everybody was aware of each other's affairs. He uttered no words in response, as he knew that speech would not alter pre-existing convictions. The winter itself would plead his case with persuasiveness that no argument could rival. The mockery started prior to the first snowfall, as the men from the settlement enjoyed spare moments to occupy themselves with the foolishness of others. At Lolo's General Emporium, where the colonizers assembled for supplies and chatter that rendered life more engaging, Duncan's dwelling MagCloud turned into a never-ending source of amusement. It gave everyone a topic to discuss during the weeks of anticipation before the actual winter arrived in the valley. A solitary man residing in a standard cabin can remain quite cozy through careful handling of his firewood and provisions. Enough timber, according to Vernon Hayes, a veteran with 20 years of building on the frontier who had witnessed many cabins being erected and collapsing, is needed to understand exactly what was effective. However, MacLeod did not construct a typical cabin. Instead, he erected a stone icebox and entered it hoping to keep warm. Stone draws warmth out of the air. That is common knowledge. His cabin is destined to be colder than any other structure in the valley, simply because it has a larger quantity of stone than any other. The Hayes study turned into the commonly accepted theory that everyone echoed whenever this subject arose in discussion. Stone soaks up heat, and Mlau possesses more rock than anyone else. Therefore, MacLeod will be colder than everyone. This logic seemed flawless to individuals who had never considered that the stone which absorbed warmth could also discharge it. A mass sufficiently large would release that heat over several hours after the initial source went out. January 1884 descended like a ravenous beast, determined to consume every bit of warmth that the men could produce. The 5th day of that month, temperatures fell to 30 degrees below zero and remained at lethal levels for 11 days. A series of winters put each cabin to the test from the valley through winter conditions that earlier winters had failed to accomplish. The constructed log cabins, following traditional methods that had been effective for many years, started to expose flaws that the climate mildness had concealed. Thomas Carrick, a well-regarded carpenter who had constructed his log cabin using standard techniques that he personally instructed to others. He noticed frost appearing on the inner walls of his dwelling. He maintained a steady fire that burned timber at a pace that would exhaust his stocks within weeks if the frigid weather persisted. His family gathered closely as near as they could to the hearth that stood at one end of the cabin. This left the opposite side of the room so cold that water turned to ice in buckets. The cold was positioned just 3 meters away from the fire that was meant to heat the entire room. The cabin's corners were spots of intense cold where nobody could stay comfortable without multiple layers of clothing that hindered movement. On the 7th of January, while his neighbors found it difficult with indoor temperatures that hardly rose above freezing, despite blazing fires, someone finally chose to confirm the forecasts about the cabin of the Scotsman. James Whitfield, a rancher whose land bordered that of Duncan, made the journey through snow up to his knees. He wanted to see with his own eyes how the man was doing who was allegedly freezing in his stone stronghold. What Whitfield discovered upon Duncan opening the entrance went against everything that the community had forecasted so assuredly after months of ridicule. The interior of Duncan's hut was heated, not merely livable, but truly cozy, in manners that Whitfield had never encountered. He had not encountered such comfort in any other dwelling in the valley throughout this spell of cold. This cold was pushing the boundaries of what standard huts could offer. Duncan was busy fixing gear with just a shirt even though outside the temperature approached minus 35 degrees. No fire blazing in the fireplace, only coals that evidently had been for many hours without being replenished. Nevertheless, the space held a temperature that Whitfield calculated to be above 15 degrees Celsius. Whitfield struggled to utter, "That's impossible." After the intense cold of the trip, the warmth surrounded him. After the harsh cold of the journey, "You lack a fire, and your cabin is even warmer than mine. It is kept alive by a steady fire which my wife has maintained for 3 days nonstop." "I had a fire 6 hours ago this morning," Duncan replied, with the composure of a person stating an obvious fact. "The stone absorbed the warmth, and now it releases it gradually into the area where I require it." Duncan gestured toward the stone column, which stood up in the middle of the room, the pillar that everyone had considered a useless use of space and materials. "That pillar is now at 40 degrees itself, and you can place your hand on it and sense the warmth radiating into the room. The stone retains the memory of the morning fire, and it reveals to the entire room throughout the afternoon." Whitfield reached out and touched the stone with disbelief that morphed into astonishment when his fingertips confirmed what Duncan had detailed. The surface emitted warmth, as if the summer sun had been blazing upon it for several hours. The scientific knowledge he had acquired indicated to him that this was impossible, yet his senses insisted that he was experiencing it in every manner. The report of Whitfield's discovery circulated throughout the community at a speed that only genuinely astonishing gossip can achieve. By the 9th of January, as the relentless cold continued, men who had evaded the construction of Duncan for months started making their own visits to confirm narratives that seemed so unlikely to be real. On January 10, Thomas Carrick arrived after a sleepless night, tending a fire that still could not keep his cabin above 5 degrees. Inside Duncan's cabin, what he found rendered him speechless for a considerable time. He processed the contrast between what he was encountering and what his own cabin provided. His own cabin was built according to every principle he had learned and taught over years of work. The data that visitors began to gather in the following days recorded differences that nobody could explain using standard theories about building and heating. Duncan's cabin kept indoor temperatures at 18 degrees Celsius, while nearby cabins struggled to sustain 3 degrees Celsius. This was a gap of 15 degrees Celsius, which represented the distinction between comfort and desperate survival. Families were terrified to sleep because dozing off meant letting the fire go out. The usage of firewood narrated a story just as striking. Hendricks recorded that he had consumed over 2 loads of wood in the initial 2 weeks of January. He was trying to maintain temperatures that just managed to keep water from freezing within his cabin. Duncan, warming a space of comparable size, achieved considerably higher temperatures. He had used less than 1 load over that same period, as his fire did not need to keep burning. Only now and then did they replenish the thermal mass that handled the actual work of temperature regulation. Duncan explained to the groups that the stone retains memory of assemblies of men who now arrived not to ridicule, but to learn what they had previously considered madness for several months. "When I ignite a fire in the morning, the stone absorbs that heat into its mass. 6,000 pounds of rock heated to 60 degrees holds energy sufficient to keep this area warm for 8 hours without fire extra. You burn wood continuously trying to warm air that perpetually leaks out through your walls. I heat stone that retains what I provide." Edward Finch, a stonemason from Helena who had voiced doubts about the design several months earlier, came back carrying a measuring tape and notebook determined to record precisely what Duncan had constructed and how it functioned. He walked around the structure, taking measurements of every dimension, checking surfaces to assess temperatures, and asking technical queries that showed his professional comprehension, ready to implement what he had learned. "Radiant efficiency is remarkable," whispered Finch, as he computed in his notebook according to the dimensions he was recording. "The warmth from a central fire travels the same distance to every wall section because the fireplace is precisely at the geometric center of the space. No energy is lost warming one side while the other stays cold, as occurs in cabins with chimneys at the ends." He lifted his eyes to the stone axis that climbed upward to the ceiling, the tower that Samuel Pritchard had labeled a waste of space. The curve of this axis does away with all convective dead zones. Warm air rises around the stone, transfers heat to the mass, and descends cooled to be reheated again. This is a constant cycle, lacking the cold patches that afflict corners of rectangular structures. Finch gazed at Duncan, admiration replacing all the doubt he had voiced months earlier, when the cabin was merely an idea and the mockery was easy. What we tried to achieve, you have done with European massive stoves, but using frontier materials and a tenth of the fuel consumption needed by those stoves. On the 19th day of January, the chill finally started to relent as temperatures climbed to levels that felt nearly cozy following the ordeal they had endured. Households came out of the huts where they had endured for weeks, emaciated and drained, having made it through but with perilously scant firewood supplies. Their shelters had been insufficient for circumstances that surpassed what prior experience had equipped nobody to confront. Duncan came out rested, his woodstock barely used relative to that of his neighbors. They had exhausted all the wood they could get to, in an attempt to sustain temperatures that could never match what his stone dwelling sustained with no noticeable effort. That night, 9 men assembled at the general store in Lolo. Nobody uttered a word for an extended period as they processed the events they had witnessed during the past weeks. The events had destroyed beliefs they had maintained through years of labor on the frontier. "We must discuss what we saw," Carrick finally spoke, shattering the silence, which had grown uncomfortable among men who were not used to acknowledging errors. "I have been a carpenter for 2 decades. I believed I knew all there was to know about building in freezing climates. McLeod showed me that I had been warming my cabins the hard way for 2 decades. Even though a superior method was accessible, I had been unwilling to pay attention to a person who had greater knowledge than I did." The shift in the perspective of the valley regarding Duncan McLeod took place with extraordinary speed after that. By the end of January, those who had openly ridiculed showed up at his door carrying notebooks and questions. They hoped to understand what they had previously dismissed as lunacy. Duncan replied to each query with patience and accuracy that exhibited no bitterness for the insults he had endured. He directed them through the concepts of thermal mass, specific caloric capacity, radiant heat distribution, and convection flow patterns. He clarified why the choice of stone was crucial and how more compact stones such as sandstone and limestone retained heat more effectively than porous granite. "It is no sorcery," he explained to them. "Simply grasp how the materials behave and build around their characteristics rather than disregarding them." In the autumn of 1884, 4 fresh cabins situated in the valley by Beirut adopted the concepts of Duncan's heat retention. Come 1887, 43 dwellings and agricultural plots within a distance of 160 kilometers had implemented some variant of the McLeod-based blueprint. Mere months earlier, everyone had labeled it insane for a headstrong Scot who had no clue how things operated in America. Duncan resided in his dwelling with oversized footings up to 1,910. He wedded in 1890 to Martha Pritchard, offspring of Samuel, who had stood as one of his sparse backers initially when all others derided him. They constructed a fresh home jointly that seamlessly integrated an even more polished version of its design of foundations. The design had proved that the stone truly recalls fire and that recalling ancient wisdom at times is the most cutting-edge type of innovation. Amen.